So thank you to everybody who's joining today on here. I'll introduce, and thank you everybody watching. So earlier, just name's Jonathan Cohn. I chair the Issues Committee with Progressive Massachusetts. Earlier this week, had people on to talk about what the state budget looks like and local budgets, and wanted to move on to onto the federal level, especially because whenever it's time to do any type of investment in like our collective well-being, the question you always end up hearing is, but where is the money? And when you look at one part of the budget, the military budget, it's clear that that question is never asked, and the same people who want to kind of question every small public every dollar spent for the public good have no problem spending like kind of sums upon sums of money for weapons. So we have a few kind of wonderful speakers join us today. I'll go in order from Jonathan Cohn, Brian Garvey, and Savina Martin. Can you just each of you introduce yourself, tell us a little bit about what you do.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Cohn. I'm a longtime professor of biology at MIT, but I also serve as the co-chair of the board of directors of Mass Peace Action. I've always been interested in the Pentagon budget all my life and been part of the fight of scientists who are fighting for investment, mostly in National Institute of Health, National Science Foundation, and never say a word about where the money is really going. But this situation has changed things. I'll talk about it because these are the investments that you need if you want a vaccine, if you want a drug, and the situation has, is beginning to crack the silo where you have to be silent about the defense budget.
I'm Brian Garvey. I'm the organizer here at Massachusetts Peace Action. And for me, the military budget is one of the most important issues in politics today. It's certainly one of the most important issues to Mass Peace Action. When you have one part of the budget that is approaching 60% of discretionary spending, it touches everything. As you said, Jonathan, you always get that question, how are you going to pay for it? But when it comes to close to 60% of discretionary spending, now $738 billion a year to the war budget, to the Pentagon, it seems like our pockets are bottomless when it comes to bombs and missiles. But this is one of the most important issues in politics today, and it's not discussed nearly enough. So I'm thrilled to be with you today discussing it.
Awesome. And then welcome, Savina.
Hi. Nice to meet you. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
My name is, again, I'm Savina Martin. I'm a longtime activist and organizer. I started out with the National Union of the Homeless, and I'm coming out of the housing takeovers, calling attention to the plight, fight, and insight of the inequities that we see and are fighting for now, particularly being unveiled right now. I'm not only a United States veteran. I came home and I was really awoke to understanding that there's no justice, right? And that we suffer the social and economic costs of endless wars in this country. And I'm currently a statewide coordinator with the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival that, of course, last year, June of 2019, unveiled the moral budget and actually discovered the trillions of dollars, right?
Yeah, yeah. And so I think to start off, we were talking kind of a little bit before about numbers. And if you want, I can put up that graphic you were sharing before, just so we can orient people about what this all even looks like. So let me do that right now. I'll try to do a share screen for me. So let me know if you all see this now, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. This worked. So can you tell us a little bit about this picture? That this is kind of Trump's kind of like FY 2021 budget. and kind of how this compares to past years. And yeah, kind of just give us kind of an overview.
Well, one thing that's important, it hardly ever gets mentioned, the discretionary budget, this is our income tax dollars. So if you see 55% of the discretionary budget, that means that 55% of the taxes you sent to Washington are going there. Now, in 100 years, though they've been collecting income taxes, no agency of the federal government has ever reported back to the people how the money is spent, right? City council reports back to you how your property taxes are spent, but they don't ever talk about how your federal budget income tax is spent. And we believe that if people knew how the tax would be spent, they have a little different activity. But the red is everything we need: housing, healthcare, Veterans Administration is civilian and not military, NIH, NSF. I'll pass on to others who want to talk about the foreign wars, you know, what that buys, the blue.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is what you're seeing right here is the cost of being at war now for almost 2 decades, for having bases, 800 military bases that we know about on foreign soil. And I think it's really important what Jonathan just pointed out, so I'll reiterate it. That 55%, that $741 billion that you're seeing in that request, that doesn't include caring for our veterans. I believe that's about 4% of discretionary spending. It also doesn't include our nuclear weapons, which are under the Department of Energy. So I know that this is a lot of the messaging that comes out of the Poor People's Campaign too, but it is true. Budgets are moral documents. They tell you about where your priorities are. And if you look at this graph, it's clear as day. We have become a national security state. The United States government exists primarily to fund wars abroad and to maintain this empire of bases and U.S. personnel and troops all over the world. And we think that it's. I always say it's why we can't have nice things. If you want to know why we can't have Medicare for all, like so many other countries around the world, why we can't have free, higher public education, why we can't have decent infrastructure, why we can't have a Green New Deal, this is the number one reason, in my opinion. Because we are piling up money at the Pentagon every year and setting it on fire. And really, I think that this pandemic that we're facing right now, and just how unprepared we were for it, you know, we don't have tests, we don't have protective equipment for our frontline workers. And we need to change our priorities and really change our definition of what national security is, in my opinion.
Yes. Okay, so we can actually see you. And Savina, any kind of comments on kind of just building off that discussion about that kind of the graph that shows like the majority of all discretionary spending is just going to the military?
Yeah, well, it just shows, particularly now with COVID-19, the complete failure. It's just a complete failure. It's unveiled and unmasked, you know, these numbers. Of course, we see the blue, right, the 55, but inside of that, I see the population of men and women and families who are not allowed to live a quality life, you know, decent life, due to the obscene and immoral spending, theft of the people's resources. And that has to really, really change, right? People are literally dying because of the bloated military budget and the theft of resources from people on the ground who essentially are working to really keep, you know, the wars going.
By the way, you know, many Americans think that money goes to the salaries of soldiers, sailors, and airmen. Half that money is contracts that go to a handful of giant corporation, enormously profitable, guaranteed profit. The government's going to buy the missiles no matter whether they work or not, right? And then, of course, if you can shoot a couple of them off, you have to buy more. The profit margins are formally guaranteed by Congress in the contract, that no matter how inefficiently or expensive, how much money the companies spend on building the weapons, they're guaranteed a profit on top of it. And the public can't find out about it because there's no audits because of national security. It's very rare to have audits. Like nuclear weapons, you can't look into it because, whoa, you know, the Russians and the Chinese, the Mexicans, the Indonesians, the Canadians, the Scots, right? You know, that information would, you know, put us at great risk. Has nothing to do with defending us from anybody, right? 100 megaton bomb can't stop one coronavirus. This is the business plan of the military industrial congressional Congress. And it's brilliant. Our tax dollars come to them and they recycle them back. They contribute them to congressional campaigns. They hire the families. They influence editors in the local communities. They give fellowships to people who say, oh yes, we really are in danger of being invaded, you know, by the Chinese.
That actually just reminds me of one thing, that kind of threat complex. It reminded me of one thing that I often, like, analogy that I remember thinking of before about the way that a lot of like national security consultants operate, kind of like people who sell diet pills and other like kind of like weight loss gimmicks, in the sense that your model is that somebody will never actually think that they're healthy. That if somebody actually thought that they were healthy or they were fit, they would not buy your product. So that there's that constant need to kind of inflate that kind of sense of insecurity and kind of sense of threats to justify a continual expenditure.
That's right. That's right. And it's really government by fear. Fear is the motivation. And as Jonathan just said, there's also, as we can see, there's a financial incentive to stay at war and to keep the American people afraid of the other. And we really see that acutely with the Trump administration. He's very open with his xenophobia and his racism. And we've seen how he's discussed even this pandemic and trying to put the blame on foreigners, trying to call it the Chinese virus. I think this is played into by military companies, by weapons manufacturers who think that if people are continually afraid of foreigners, of other countries, that they will support having a gargantuan military budget. I mean, you compare these to, this is over 5 times what China spends on its military. It's over 10 times what Russia spends on its military. There is no logical reason why the United States military budget is this large. But I think it has a lot to do with the fear that is so often stoked by politicians and by these lobbyists as well.
Cole, are you doing tech support? Are you in the discussion?
What was that?
Oh, no, I was asking. Okay, so Cole's not in the discussion.
Well, I'm here off camera if you need me.
Yeah, welcome, Cole.
All right, you're an emergency.
Cole knows a lot about this, so I'm sure if he.
So one of the things, you know, yesterday, I think it was yesterday, finally the Democrats were able to get through, and some Republicans were able to get through a war powers resolution saying that the president can't just, you know, go to war against Iran. He vetoed it. And sadly, there was an effort to override the veto, but all the Democrats stood together and voted to override, but not enough Republicans. It's very unfortunate.
And I think that that's actually a testament to like the kind of an impressive work of some of the anti-war organizing in recent years that I just remember like Democrats actually like being willing to challenge presidential power on wars. Granted, some of that has to do with like who's in the White House now, and that does often change parties' responses. But like when seeing people finally being willing to criticize the US's atrocities in Yemen, or kind of being willing to impose like some accountability, it was kind of like a refreshing thing to see, like a movement on that front, which hopefully continues.
Well, we are certainly hoping that the coronavirus crisis is going to a little bit shake the foundations of, sending all this money to the military.
Mm-hmm.
It's unbelievable that the government, or at least its cronies, are still proposing that the U.S. spend $1.7 trillion over the next 20 or 30 years,
Wow.
$1,000 billion on upgrading nuclear weapons. Right, we've got thousands of nuclear weapons. Got 14 Ohio-class submarines, each of them, 24 missiles. Each missile has 12 independently targeted warhead. One submarine, either by accident or intent, if they launch, can wipe out all the major cities of any single country in the world, of China, of Russia, of India. What's the government? What is the Pentagon saying? We need to buy 10 more, right? I mean, that's $100 billion, and we don't have enough money for masks, gowns, test kits, ventilators. That's why. That's why. It's not just money, right? It's scientific resources, technological resources going totally to waste. Those weapons don't get you to work. They don't house you. They don't clothe you. They don't protect your health. They don't help you discover other discoveries. They're just one of the biggest boondoggles ever put over on the American people.
Your point about nuclear weapons reminds me of like one thing that I've often put it is like you can only destroy the world so many times. Like once you get like the numbers of nuclear weapons, like what are you doing after that point? Like it's that you can't, like, even if using one would be disastrous, and that like having that size of capacity, it literally can't accomplish anything.
Well, but you should read some of these, secret documents. They are insane.
Yeah.
What if some people survive? What if some Russians survive the first round of attacks? We have to have enough missiles for a second round, even though most of us will.
Yeah.
I mean, it is really bizarre.
Yeah, some of these documents just brushing off estimates of hundreds of millions of deaths. It's a moral issue as well as a financial issue. And I'd like to hear a bit from Savina on that because we're spending a fortune on these weapons that Jonathan just describes that if they were ever used, if they could only be used in a genocidal way. It would put the whole species at risk.
Yeah.
But to show the importance, we just talked about that veto and the failed override that happened today. Foreign policy often doesn't get a lot of attention in the political press. But if you look at Trump's vetoes, the majority of them, the vast majority of them, I think 6 out of 7, have been on foreign policy issues. This one that we saw yesterday, he vetoed War Powers Resolution to end our participation in Yemen, and he vetoed several bills that would have cut off arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, who are big buyers of U.S. military equipment. Saudi Arabia's military budget is now bigger than Russia's.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Jonathan, you asked what has changed in recent years. So, there have been some big social movements. You remember, when Trump first came into office, right, hundreds of thousands of people took to the street. It was the healthcare, the climate rallies, and the women's marches. And 2 years ago, those marches were silent on the military budget. 200,000 people marched in Washington for climate. At the tail end of the 200,000, there were 50 peace action marches saying cut nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Nobody else, not 190,000. But the Poor People's Campaign has changed that, right? Because the Poor People's Campaign has this absolute mass base and has put right up front that militarism is, is one of the sources of poverty. So that is something new, right?
Mhm.
To have a real mass movement who doesn't pretend, who doesn't look the other way when you try to talk about military spending. So we are excited about that in Massachusetts. The Poor People's Campaign and Peace Action have worked together very, very productively, even though we represent really different constituencies, really different.
Yeah, Savina, do you want to talk about that, kind of like the resurgence of the Poor People's Campaign, and kind of, and the work in particular, like what does a moral budget look like, as you were kind of starting to talk about before?
Right. Well, the Poor People's Campaign is clear, right? We usually say we want to be clear, committed, and competent as much as we can. The beauty of it is led from the bottom up, right? But it's everybody's movement. I think we had the resurgence on the edges of Dr. King's Beyond Vietnam speech, and within that speech, he addressed those three evils, right? Militarism and poverty, systemically he addressed those. But more importantly, he was very clear that we were moving from an era of civil rights to human rights, and that we all need each other in order to change and right the wrongs of this society, right? Of the injustices that he spoke of. And once he was clear about human rights, we were able to do the work and not be divided because of the color of our skin, right? Because of our sexual orientation. And that's what the Poor People's Campaign today represents. It's led by the most poor and dispossessed and its allies. We have a group of faith leaders, faith councils. We have students that are involved. Each organization, we have 43 locals within the states, 43, campaigns across the US. Each campaign has 3 tri-chairs, has a tri-chair set up. Well, at least we try to, right? And then we have partners like MAPPA. In Massachusetts, MAPPA was the first organization to come to us and partner. And then I have a long history with Jonathan anyway. He's like my adopted uncle. So it's evident today within this pandemic that across the US, the Poor People's Campaign has proven, not only with facts, but with faces and evidence, that the United States has an abundance of resources. And we clearly understand that these resources have been placed within the military budget. I mean, within the military industrial complex, right? This country thrives off of war, lives off of war. I mean, I'm not a combat vet, but I was a part of that poverty, the poverty draft, right? Part of the, I went for that seduction. And we see hundreds of thousands of military veterans coming back from war and service, and they cannot get the resources in the abundance that we live in. There are not enough, at least they say, not enough resources to provide housing, right? Adequate jobs, a living wage. This is against the Constitution. This falls into the Declaration of Human Rights. The way people are living today and dying as a result of this pandemic goes against the Declaration of Human Rights. Look at the article, 25 through 29 or 29. People have a right to live. And that's what the moral budget states. Our theme is everyone has a right to live. Everyone has a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We could talk about data all day long. That's okay. We need the stats. We need to quantify what's happening. We need to break down every single demographic to its lowest common denominator. But in the end, we are talking about human lives who have a right to live, and we need to dismantle those 5 evils that Reverend Barbara talks about on the heels of Dr. King. those evils that interlock with everything that's unveiled today: systemic racism, systemic poverty, militarism, ecological devastation, and the distorted moral narrative. You know, how religion also plays a deep, deep role in that institution by holding the poor hostage in a way, if I can say that. Some. Do you understand clearly what I'm saying? And that's in Isaiah. How dare you create legislation and leave the poor and widow and orphan without? I mean, so what we do is we shift that narrative, right? We shift the narrative to build power and to influence elections and to change policies.
Nice.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
it's
the Center for Policy Studies has done a remarkable work on the moral budget, Jonathan, which is
Nice.
right. So
Right, yeah.
they've done a remarkable job on it.
Yeah, I think
Savina mentioned.
Savina's really speaking to the intersectionality of these issues. You know, I wasn't taught in school, and I don't think many people are, that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is one of the most important peace activists in the history of this country. You know, and that Beyond Vietnam speech, when he came out against the war in Vietnam in 1967, he took a lot of flack for that. You know, he lost a lot of popularity. There was still a lot of support for the war, and he was accused of being unpatriotic. But he connected those issues. He connected poverty and militarism. It's the same issue. You know, just like climate justice is the same issue.
Yes.
The Pentagon is the largest single polluter as an institution in the world. It's the same issue. You know, gun violence. I do not think it's a coincidence at all that we are seeing this increase in gun violence, some of which is perpetrated with military weapons. I think that violence carries over from our never-ending wars overseas, and it comes home.
It does.
I think it absolutely does. So I think what we're trying to do with our involvement with the Poor People's Campaign, and really in all of our work, is connect progressive issues. And peace is one of those issues. It's a racial justice issue as well. As I was talking about before, the fear of the other, the fear of the person overseas that doesn't look like you. I suspect strongly that if the victims of the U.S. military looked like me, I don't think that the American public would stand for it. I think it's the racial justice issue as well.
It reminds me as well that you do see that phenomenon very often about the different types of technologies used by the U.S. in wars abroad end up coming home and kind of used by police, basically often for the kind of terrorizing Black and brown communities and kind of different forms of surveillance and kind of an overly aggressive policing, or even there's ludicrous photos that you see of local police departments having tanks. That there's no possible reason why they would need one, let alone multiple. One point that I wanted to go back to that Jonathan, you kind of alluded to before, is how when talking about a budget, it's not just kind of abstract numbers, that really you also have this kind of movement of productive capacity, research capacity, scientific knowledge, away from focusing on issues of kind of meeting the needs of the public and well-being, and shifting that capacity, that research, that knowledge into weapon creation and advancement. Do you want to talk a little bit about that dynamic?
Well, first let me say that getting out of this coronavirus situation requires scientific biomedical research, requires vaccines, requires new drugs, better tests. In my experience, at least most citizens of Massachusetts assume that those kind of things come out of the healthcare system. Somehow they're paid for by Medicare or Medicaid or health insurance or hospitals. No, not at all. Biomedical research depends entirely on the National Institutes of Health, National Science Foundation, Center for Disease Control. Those are agencies have their own budget, right? And people often think the National Institute of Health is a place in one. It is a place in Bethesda, but it's an agency that sends money out through the country. Thousands and thousands of graduate students across Massachusetts are paid by the National Institute of Health to carry out biomedical research, right? MIT doesn't pay biomedical graduate students. Taxpayers pick up the stipend and the tuition, and that's as it should be, because it makes them public servants. But for example, in the CARES Act, March 27th, where the Congress finally voted, I don't know, the estimates are hundreds of billions to trillions, but it was a lot of money to kind of get us through the difficult situation. In fact, the National Institutes of Health got $1 billion. That's not very much when you're trying to come up with a new vaccine. Centers for Disease Control got $2.5 billion, and the Advanced Research Agency, BARDA, which also is very important vaccine research, $3.5 billion. It sounds like a lot, right? It doesn't add up to the cost of one new submarine. And in fact, they gave the Pentagon another $10 billion over the 738 because of stresses of the coronavirus. So even in the crisis, right, you still have the situation that public health is being nickeled and dimed when tens of thousands of Americans are dying from this disease. And now I want to switch back. I know that progressive mass is interested in politics, political arena. Savina mentioned, even the Poor People's Campaign is moving into dealing with elections. Early on, Peace Action endorsed Bernie Sanders. For the first time, we had a presidential candidate who talked about military spending. That was great, opened things up. We're very nervous now about the situation. We don't know what's going to happen at the convention, but we do have some very important races in Massachusetts, because we have Senator Markey, who is the leading senator in the United States Senate calling for nuclear disarmament. First use, the SANE Act. He's being challenged by Representative Kennedy. We think it's very important to return Senator Markey to keep his seat. We also think that there's a bunch of other elections, maybe Brian can mention them, US Rep seats, and also the state legislature. We think that it is crazy that Massachusetts has a feudal, an F-E-U-D-A-L, feudal system for the state legislature, right? Where a few people at the top, have all the influence. So we think that it's really important. We share with you the importance of electing progressive candidates, all the way from the bottom to the top, and also with our revolution. Brian, maybe you can run some of the key races there.
Sure, absolutely. I think your audience at Progressive Mass understands that not all Democrats are created alike, right? And I want to talk a bit more about the military budget and remind everyone that this is not a partisan issue, right? This has been a problem that has gone on while Republicans have been in the Oval Office, while Democrats have been in the Oval Office. So you look at that amount of money that we were talking about, over $740 billion. And the vast majority of Democrats voted for that budget. I'm sorry to have to say, and the majority of our representatives here in Massachusetts voted for that budget too. There were some exceptions. Jim McGovern out of Worcester is great on these issues. Our new freshman Congresswoman superstar Ayanna Pressley voted against it and came out against it strongly. Senator Warren and Senator Markey both came out strongly against it. And even Mr. Kennedy from CD4 came out against it. But I do suspect that has a little something to do with the fact that he's running against a progressive champion on these issues, Ed Markey. So there are some reps that we're supporting as well. The Democrats that we would like to see. Out in Western Massachusetts, a young mayor from Holyoke, Alex Morse, is challenging one of the most powerful Democrats, and a corporate Democrat at that. He's the head of Ways and Means, Mr. Richard Neal, Chairman Richard Neal, I should say. He voted for that budget. Young progressive champion Hassan Lecky is running in the open seat that has now been created since Kennedy's running against Markey. She is wonderful on peace issues. She participates in our rallies. She would be a fantastic congresswoman. And we're also lending our support to cadre more than ever. I think over 25 now state legislators who are running for office. Because we need progressive politics here in the State House too. Massachusetts is seen as a progressive state. But if you look at how our legislature runs, and I know you know this, Jonathan, it is not a progressive system, and that needs to change. So we don't just, we look at the presidency, we look at federal office, we look at the state legislature, up and down the ballot. We want to make peace an issue, a progressive issue.
To build on that, like, so what are some of the things that the state legislature could do? Because I know that you do have some bills that Massachusetts Action helped file at the start of the session to kind of help Massachusetts push back to the extent that the state can on this kind of like ever kind of this like ongoing growth of military spending in our own states as like a state with like a large defense cut, like on base, to like in the extent that we can kind of almost let's say mitigate Massachusetts' role.
We filed our supporters together with progressive legislators in the House and Senate. We filed a slew of bills. Some of them had some real teeth. One of them was, for example, requesting that the Massachusetts Pension Fund divest from companies that manufacture nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Massachusetts already pension fund years back divested from companies that manufacture tobacco because they understood that tobacco kills people with nuclear weapons, right? If tobacco does, certainly nuclear weapons. That, of course, didn't get out of committee, but we had a hearing, we brought people together. Then we had a couple other ones that involve the state, for example, the People's Budget Bill asked the state to set up a commission that would report back to Massachusetts taxpayers what's the consequences in Massachusetts of spending of the U.S. Congress spending all that money, right? And most people don't realize, and the state doesn't make it clear. For example, the transportation budget in Massachusetts, 30% of it comes from the federal appropriations. So when federal funds are cut for public transportation, that cuts that. That's why there's not enough money to run the T, the red line, the green line. Those facilities were built with federal funds. They weren't built off of property taxes or fares. Notion that you can keep a modern train system running off what you put in the turnstile. No other country on earth does it. Right? Only the U.S. But most Massachusetts citizens don't know that the red line cars were bought with federal funds, 30 years ago. And then we've had a couple of bills that speak explicitly to the nuclear weapons issues. For example, no first use, right? That the Massachusetts legislature should call upon our congressional delegation to say no first use of nuclear weapons. And
it's somewhat self-explanatory, but just shorthand, what does the term no first use mean?
So right now, President Trump can just push the button, doesn't have to check with anybody, not the Congress, not the Pentagon. There's always somebody with him, carries what they call a football, which is the controls. And there's no democratic process whatsoever. It's total absolute monarchy. And we and other groups around the country think that is insane. Right?
Yeah.
Dude,
Yeah.
launch a nuclear war, especially someone as unstable as Trump. Right?
Yeah.
So, that doesn't cut any jobs, right? It just changes the control of it. Next year we'll be back. We're learning how to do this, working with people like you, and who have more experience, and we'll build some broader coalitions around the state legislature.
Nice. One thing I was thinking of as well is that when it comes to, say, federal military spending, one of the most kind of interesting things I remember seeing was I think I was at the Roots Camp conference years ago. You had one presenter who had this like booklet, and it was something that I think the defense, like the weapons manufacturers lobby puts together, and it's showing where all of which congressional districts all of the weapons are manufactured in. It's like, oh look, this weapon has parts in this district, and this district, and this district. And it's this like perverse way of locking in support, because it means people think of it and see like jobs in their district. How can we push back about that like perverse way in which like so many people, like the only industrial policy somebody's willing to support is more weapons in their district? And the way that makes so many people often go against their own stated values in support of more weaponry.
No, they have that's the only way they can, like this project, the F-35, most expensive weapons project ever, ever launched, and they don't work, right? You can't fly them because they crash. But the contracts have been let in every congressional district in the United States, right? And it's, on the one hand, they say, oh, we have to worry about the Russians. But then if you really point out that this is not going to save for the Russians, well, it's jobs, right? We need it for jobs. Mm-hmm. So if you decided you weren't going to let the bridges crumble and the water get contaminated and the highways fall apart, right? And you move that F-35 money into productive investment infrastructure. So UMass Amherst did a study on this a couple of years ago, Professor Robert Pollan, where they compared exactly how many jobs they create with civilian investment compared to military investment. And you get many more jobs. So the jobs argument is false in the general arena. On the other hand, if you are employed in one of those factories, that's your job, right? Mm-hmm. So those groups, end up mobilizing to defend the military budget. And we know that the IBEW electricians at Raytheon, right, are going to defend Raytheon making missiles that are used to kill innocent children in Yemen on a economic jobs front, because we don't have something else to offer them. If we had something else to offer them, it would be different, but we don't. Mm-hmm. That's why we need a moral budget, right? We need to shift the money, right?
And like affirmative, yeah. And it's I'm glad you brought up Raytheon, because this is not something undefined. I mean, we have one of the largest weapons manufacturers in the world. One of the most powerful members of the military-industrial complex is based in Waltham, Massachusetts. I mean, I could drive to, I think, 2 or 3 different Raytheon facilities from my house in 15 minutes. I mean, it's right, the military-industrial complex is right here in eastern Massachusetts. And if you want to know how powerful they are, our Secretary of Defense, a man who is in charge of the U.S. military, his job before joining the Trump administration, this guy, Mark Esper, top lobbyist for Raytheon. I mean, that's the one good thing about the Trump administration. He doesn't know well enough to hide it. He puts the corruption right out for everyone to see. He drained the swamp, and then he put the swamp monsters at the bottom in charge of the different federal agencies.
Yeah. Savina, as we were talking about like, as Jonathan was just talking about all the different investments that we could be making instead, what are some of the like top parts of what like the moral budget would look like? Kind of some of the key things that we could be investing in if we decided to shift priorities around.
Of course, we're talking about infrastructure, transportation, right? Livable wages, right? Get away from the high rents and low wages, right? Decent housing.
Yeah, because there's been like a massive federal disinvestment in housing over the decades.
And it's a lot of jobs. You build housing or you renovate housing. A lot of employment and local employment.
This country can do it. They can build houses. I mean, if you could build an F-18 fighter jet, you could end homelessness, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just ridiculous, you know, but some of the, you know, we want to reinvest in the people, you know, healthcare issues, access, you know, I mean, it goes on and on.
And the kind of healthcare point reminds me of, it's such a great point that I know, like, I know you mentioned before, I believe, like, I think Jonathan and Brian, you might have as well, about how with the military budget, it doesn't even include like investments in veterans. So you do end up having issues of like veteran homelessness or unemployment, so that that kind of large part of the budget isn't even dealing with everything, all the fallout that part of the budget ends up.
I mean, most people are absolutely shocked when you tell them. They don't believe you. Well, I don't talk about it because people don't believe me. I say the Veterans Administration is not part of the defense budget, right? These people who, the reason that they're wounded is because they were fighting the wars. That doesn't count, right?
Yeah.
It's just,
I worked in a tent, in a tent built by veterans for homeless veterans in Point Loma, California, on naval base property. They built a tent that was the size of a football field. Now, veterans are used to setting up bivouacs. So they're used to setting up, you know, tents, building trenches, digging trenches for, you know, toiletries. We could set up everything. Water buffaloes and on and on. You can build a city. I mean, that's what they do when they go to war, right? They soften the soil. And that's what war is. You soften the soil, you go in and you wreak havoc on these communities or villages, and you set it up your way. Well, when the veterans come home and they've had a really bad discharge, or they've had a mental break due to the mental effects of war, they come back with a myriad of issues, mental health issues, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder, TBIs, different traumatic brain injuries from hearing the bombs. I had a veteran once that, well, several times, that if he heard a car backfire, you know, or he couldn't drive in traffic because he thought there were IEDs everywhere he would drive. Then I had a woman who loved the beach, but she could no longer go to the beach because of the sand. When she did several tours of duty in Iraq, and the sand just broke her. It just gave her, you know, swallowing it and smothering nearly, you know. And so there's things that we never as a civilian would think about that happens to veterans when they come back, when they're deployed back, and they say they don't have these services. And then they also have special pods in prison, in jails, where they place veterans separate from the regular population. So we've got a lot of work to do to do this type of military industrial complex, to get a hold of, you know, the funds to put them back and invest in the people that go and fight the wars and the folks that are on the ground that live here. COVID-19 is manifesting in a way psychologically like war. So we're gonna have to really think through post-pandemic to make sure that these materials and the resources, the mental health clinics are, you know, equipped to facilitate nurses and doctors and other essential workers. And it's all of it goes back to the military budget.
And it's much more than a financial issue, as Savina just laid out. I mean, these are people that we're supposed to hold up and say, you know, cheer them at a baseball game, but step over the homeless veteran on the sidewalk. It doesn't add up. You know, it's something has got to change. But there's an opportunity. I mean, this military budget, this Defense Authorization Act that authorizes it, is one of the only must-pass pieces of legislation in the federal government. It has passed now 59 years in a row.
Wow.
I mean, in a Congress that can't get anything done, this is something that they pass every year.
Yeah.
So,
so what does that look like? What does that look like for this year now? Like, kind of going, since it tends to be, I think, around the summer when they end up starting to, that kind of each chamber has to pass their own and they conference stuff, but especially given all the economic climate What does the landscape look for the battles around the
I'll tell
NDA
you,
this year?
the interesting signals coming out of the Congress, because a few very progressive, like Ro Khanna, have
Mhm.
said, hey, in this coronavirus situation, you know, we can't have the military, the NDAA as usual. We can't have it keep going. Meanwhile, the chair of the committee has said, oh, well, we can't let this coronavirus issue get in the way of the National Defense Authorization. You know, we're going to go full speed ahead. So we are very, you know, we don't know. We don't know. We're going to be watching this very closely and try to be players in it, try to get at least the Progressive Caucus to take a strong stand. And, you know, we need all you guys, everybody, you know, on board on this.
That reminds me of one thing that would be great if you can talk about, because one thing I always find, like, just kind of one of the many, like, kind of gross parts of it is the budgetary tricks that they end up using with, let's say, the overseas contingency operations fund every year, so that they can pretend that they're not actually spending as much money as they are by just moving it. Neither you, like, any of you talk about what that actually is.
It is so absurd that it's very hard to talk about it, because so irrational people think you're crazy. Right? So the Congress some years back in 2011 passed this bill, what they call sequesters, which is really about how much money can you spend on defense and all non-defense. It's not about the 12 different categories. It's just about military versus civilian, and they never make it clear. My scientific colleagues never understand that this is about making sure that the military gets their money. So they cap it, but these guys are so greedy, they're not willing to let that go. So they add this, quote, emergency appropriation, the overseas contingency. What does it stand for?
Yeah, I think it's OCO, Overseas Contingency Operations.
Which they said that's not part of the budget, right? It's paid for by our tax dollars, but it's not going to be part of the budget. So it's just, you know, there's no end to it, but maybe coronavirus. But we are hoping that the crisis that the civilian population is facing is going to allow coalitions to form that never would form before. And our experience, just in the last 6 months, we've been able to have conversations on this that we never could have before. You know, with groups that you know, kept us at a distance. They said, oh, it's nice that you're for peace, but, you know, that's not on the agenda. So we're hoping that a lot of these organizations, I would say we were at the rally, the caravan. There were two of them, but one was AFL-CIO rallying with the postal workers, and then afterwards with the medical workers at this emergency hospital that they've set up at the convention center. And it was on May Day. The AFL-CIO in Massachusetts has never touched May Day, right? That's the International Workers' Day, Socialist Workers, they wait for Labor Day. But they rallied on Labor Day, and the president of the Greater Boston AFL-CIO, giving the opening speech, said, you know, this is International Workers' Day. You know, I almost fell off my seat because I had never heard anybody in the AFL-CIO say that. But the pressure, the effort to privatize the post office, that's the way to get rid of democracy, right? Make sure you can't have mail-in votes, and you have a condition where people can't go to vote. So I think some of the old silos are cracking, and you know, we got to keep working together. Thanks for having us on. You know?
Yeah, no, it's fun. So one kind of great kind of like parting thing that like a few of you have alluded to before is about how does the whole discussion of what national security even is need to change, especially as we see something how like the pandemic is going to be, it's killing like an order of several times more people than like any terrorist attack has ever done, or even a kind of accumulation of them. But it gets talked about fundamentally differently. Like, how does that whole discourse, like, what do you think? Comments about how that whole discourse itself needs to change. Well,
the people who there's a group of people I know that kind of shills for the military-industrial complex, professors of blah, 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 that talk about national security and things like that. They are shifting and saying, well, yes, and they're agreeing with you. we have to talk about national security more broadly, and that includes public health. So there is a group of people who used to say that, oh, well, you know, you have to protect national military security, who see that that situation may be weakening a little bit, sliding over. Some of our own folks in our nuclear disarmament working group, we have the same push. People say, okay, we have to redefine national security to, I myself don't like it. National security is the language of the military industrial complex, right? I prefer talking about public health, but I'm happy, you know, if some of our reps and senators want to vote more money for public health and saying that's national security, fine.
Yeah.
Fine. We'll stick with them.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one important thing to, not to hit you with more statistics, but I mean, it's a sad thing to report, but we've lost more people to this pandemic in the last couple of months than we lost in our entire involvement in the Vietnam War. In a couple of months.
Right.
I mean, I think that really reveals what's a threat to the American people and what is not. But I think of particular interest on the military budget in an election year. Congress is going to be deciding what the military is authorized to do and how much money it gets without knowing who the commander-in-chief is going to be next year. We don't know. President Trump could be reelected. Last year, they put in several progressive amendments that one of them was very similar to the bill that Trump just vetoed yesterday. It would have prohibited him from starting a war with Iran. We saw amendments like that stripped out. And then 3 weeks later, on January 2nd, Trump almost got us into a war with Iran. So we need to be hitting our congresspeople hard, letting them know that these kind of restrictions absolutely need to be in this bill, this affirmative bill, this bill that cannot just be vetoed and thrown aside by Trump. These progressive provisions need to be in our military budget. We need to make that part of the issue. And if they're not, I don't think a single one of them should vote yes on the military budget.
I'd like to add another dimension having to do with the discussions within our own groups, for example, within Progressive Mass. One thing we run into periodically is people saying, well, it's not the politicians, it's the American people are really worried about the Ruskies, or they're really worried about the Red Chinese, or they're really worried about North Koreans. So I'm very active around housing and transit issues. And Cambridge, we live in Central Square. It's not the height. You know, there are plenty of people who, you know, they have a house, but they're barely paying the bills. I've been at many conferences on housing and transit. And I have never run into somebody who is worried about getting evicted from their house, right? In my experience, they are not worried about the Russians. And they are not worried about the Chinese. It is claimed that Americans are really worried about that. I think that is a stone lie. I think Americans are worried about paying tuition. They're worried about paying healthcare bills for their parents who can have Alzheimer's, right? They're worried about getting coronavirus. They are not worried that we are going to be invaded either by Russians or North Koreans. There are always a few people around who say that, and often you find that they're paid to do that. At MIT, they're the people who have the Air Force fellowships. It's not across their forehead. You have a general forum, and then someone gets up and says, well, he says, the American people are really worried about the Russians. And then you ask, who is this guy? And then afterwards you find, oh, it's somebody who has an Air Force, you know, Raytheon Fellowship, you know, for international security. So that is a way of blocking, you know, the development of a much more authentic. We're not worried about the Russians. Raytheon wants us to be, but Americans are not.
I have seen as a result of this pandemic unfolding, you know, I thought I saw a lot before, and I usually say I've been to hell and back, but this is so unprecedented, what I'm seeing on the ground happening and unfolding every day, you know, hearing from not just essential workers, but I'm actually hearing from essential communities. You know, and just recently joined a group where we could pay attention to the most, you know, disproportionate communities that are unveiling, you know, what they need is hazard pay, right? Because they're going out every day, you know, risking their lives without any, you know, armor, you know, right? Nothing to fight with. So I think this has changed me on a whole nother level, really seeing this unfold and hearing today about the funeral parlors, right? And then having some of the Poor People's Campaign folks calling me saying my uncle died, and you know, I just lost our kid's grandmother, just passed away, was in a nursing home, just buried her. My sister right now has pneumonia.
Oh wow.
My daughter had COVID. So you know, I'm seeing this thing unfolding. I'm like, oh my God, I'm gonna lose my mind here. So you know, funeral parlors are packed. You know, folks that are poor cannot afford to pay. You know, so the funerals are an industry. I mean, so, you know, this thing keeps going on and on and on. You know, and I can go on and on and on, but we really need to look and unfold and make drastic changes here at the legislative level. And anyway.
I hope they feel better. I'm going to quickly get that in, but so I don't want to hold you all too long. So in the final takeaways, so what would you want somebody watching now, watching later, to leave with from this discussion?
Well, one, they got to pay close attention to budget votes in the state legislature and budget votes in the U.S. Congress, and the Boston Globe isn't going to help them, right? This is a kind of situation that people are going to have to find organizations like Progressive Mass, like Peace Action, like the Poor People's Campaign, that communicate with them. What is your rep going to vote on this? Because when they vote for the military budget, they don't want the constituents to know about that. So, you know, we think that those votes are really key, and that the country has a political infrastructure to keep people ignorant about how their taxes are spent. So there's a little under the surface battle there. It's not very romantic or dramatic to get these issues raised much higher.
Yeah, I would say get involved. This whole pandemic has been depressing, and when I get down, I find the best way to pick myself up is to get involved, to do some activism, to fight back. That's what makes me feel better. So I would encourage everyone listening to check us out over at masspeaceaction.org. See about joining up, see about signing up to get alerts from us. We'll keep you informed over this, and I would encourage people to join the efforts of the Poor People's Campaign as well. I mean, you're not going to find a better organization than that. Just to give you a little plug, Savina.
Thank you.
And then, so yeah, Savina, final takeaways for those watching. Yeah.
Okay.
June 20th.
Ditto, my comrades. Yeah, get involved, get engaged, stay engaged, study, understand what the moral budget is. You know who your state legislatures are. Please register to vote. Just stay engaged. We're here. MAPPA is online. We're all partnered up. You know, the Poor People's Campaign is gearing up for June 2020. Stay engaged.
And then how can people want to learn more about the Poor People's Campaign? Where should they go?
Massachusetts Poor People's Campaign, Facebook, Massachusetts Poor People's Campaign, Twitter and Instagram, and the National Poor People's Campaign is on Facebook and every other social media outlet.
Awesome. Well, I would like to Jonathan, Brian, and Savina, I want to thank you so much for joining. I think this has been a great discussion. And I'll thank Cole, who's been on in the background as well, for all of his help too.
Tech support.
And then, yeah, and thank you to everybody who's listening now or who will be listening later.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. It's been a pleasure.
Everybody in Progressive Mass. Take care.